I give you Dr.
Hey, thank you, John, so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here today on a beautiful day, and thanks to your association for inviting me here. I'm very excited to share my work. So the title of my talk today is Letchworth State Park, a fresh look from the Letchworth State Park Atlas. As John mentioned, a lot of my presentation today will be based upon my two-year project, the Letchworth State Park Atlas, which produced a series of over 100 pages of maps on Letchworth State Park. To give you a bit more details about this book, as John mentioned, this is a book that was published in August of 2022 by SUNY Press. It has actually over 130 pages of maps, many of which are colored. It also has photography by local photographer Keith Walters. There's 35 colored photographs in it. On Amazon and other venues, it lists for $29.95. It is a paperback book. Today, for those of you who are attending in person, I have it on sale for $25, and I'm happy to sign it if you would like. What I'd like to do in today's talk are kind of two big parts. First of all, I just want to talk about the creation of the Atlas. And then in part two, what I want to talk about is actually just to read some book excerpts. And what I want to do is kind of reconstruct by first deconstructing my Letchworth State Park Atlas, and I want to focus on the environmental and natural history of the park, just given the nature of your association and kind of themes that you cover in this lecture series. So first, I just want to give some background into this book, how it began. John hinted at that already. I want to talk about my roots with Letchworth State Park a bit more, and some of the inspiration that I found elsewhere for putting together this atlas. As John mentioned, I have deep roots with the park. My two kids have become the sixth generation to visit Letchworth State Park. My great-great-grandfather grew up in Mount Morris. His brother, my great-great-great-uncle, was Albert Hill of Mount Morris, New York, in the late 19th century. Here's a portrait of him, and he was an avid photographer during an era when photographs became, cameras became kind of widespread, kind of the late 19th century. So on this next slide, I have photographs that are really family heirlooms. These are 5 photographs that he took that we've dated to approximately the 1890s, just based upon the structures that are present and some other clues. So we have some notable landmarks here within Letchworth State Park. Moving from north to south, we have Hogsback, Gibsonville, Lower Falls, Middle Falls, and Upper Falls. So these photos have always been an heirloom, as mentioned. It's always been an inspiration of mine, and I've always been curious about this park. My great-great-great-uncle Albert's photos were always kind of a mystery to me. I knew Letchworth State Park, but there were so many curious things about these photographs. Like Gibsonville, there were these abandoned ruins of paper mills, and there's old salt box houses there. Lower Falls, I was always curious about why it looked so different back then as it does now. I was also curious as to how someone could actually hike all the way down to almost the bottom of Lower Falls without any sort of protective barriers. And there's also a train there at Upper Falls crossing the wrought iron bridge. So I was always just really interested in both the natural and environmental history of the park. Another source of inspiration for the Letchworth State Park Atlas was the Adirondack Atlas. This is one of my favorite books. For my entire life, I've probably spent, the equivalent of many months in the Adirondacks. There's a book that's coming up on 20 or 25 years old called the Adirondack Atlas, the Geographic Portrait of the Adirondack Park, which is this encyclopedic volume covering all these different aspects of the Adirondack Park. And so I've always wanted to engage in a project that is similar to this, right? So I thought, why not Letchworth State Park? It doesn't have a thematic map atlas, so I might as well go for it. So in June of 2020, just a few months after the pandemic really began, I was hiking around Letchworth State Park, thinking about projects to engage in. And on a nice long half-day hike in Letchworth State Park, I thought about all these amazing maps you could make related to the park. I got home, I started writing down ideas for thematic maps. That day, I probably had 30 or 40 ideas in that long list of what sorts of maps that could be made there related to the park. So in many ways, there's many roots to this project, kind of personal, professional, but also it was a pandemic project. And I think there's a lot of interesting scholarship and art that's coming out of this forest time indoors, right? So within this first part of my talk, I now want to just talk about what this atlas entails before I then get into reading book excerpts on the natural environmental history of the park. Text is broken down into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 presents an overview of the park. In this chapter, I present simply the location, the geographic context of the park. I provide the map reader with maps on place names. I have a map comparing the size of Letchworth State Park to other notable parks. I also have some maps in here of drive time for major urban centers, just to help readers who might not be familiar with the park to acquaint themselves with it, to contextualize it geographically. As you'll see in some of my later maps, there is a fair percentage of people who are not from Western Europe who visit Letchworth State Park that are from elsewhere in the US. We also have users, rather visitors that come from Canada, even overseas as well. So what I'll do is I'll talk about each of these maps in your chapters, and then I'll give you a few example maps from each of these chapters. So for instance, with map 11, this is a map of selected place names in historical or vernacular terms in the park. Oftentimes in this atlas, given the long linear nature of the park, I have to break up the park into the north end and the south end. So here's one map. And then I'll just also oftentimes in this presentation, I'll zoom in for you just to give you a sense of the detail in this map. So this map was a lot of fun to put together. There are a lot of names on here that we're probably familiar with, like Lower Falls, Middle Falls, Upper Falls, but there's also a lot of more obscure or antiquated names to places in the park. Great Bend or Big Bend, there's historical references to that being called Devil's Saddle. There's also some places down by Lower Falls like the Flume or Table Rock or Shango Spring. I also have in here some of the indigenous names that the Seneca bestowed upon places within the park as well. In chapter 2, I present the physical geography of the park. This includes its geology, its land history and ecological communities, aspects of its weather and climate, as well as the Genesee River. In the geology section, I have maps on the bedrock types, the sedimentary layers of rock that have been laid down over time, over eons. I also talk about the formation of the park, its glacial history. In land history, ecological communities, I have maps that portray the change in land cover over the last 300 years, the last 100 years. As we saw the park area go from nearly continuously forested to deforested in a lot of places, only to be then reforested and to retain its heavily forested character that we see today. In weather and climate, I cover natural disasters that occasionally strike the park, aspects of its climate, like its precipitation and temperature. And then in the Genesee River section, I talk about the Genesee River watershed, its land cover, and also given the uniqueness of the dam and the sorts of environmental impacts that that has on the Genesee River, on the park. I also spend a fair number of maps just talking about the Genesee River and the Mount Morris Dam. One of my favorite maps from this chapter is on forest ecological communities. In 2004, there was a fairly rigorous survey of ecological communities within the park. This data are somewhat dated, however, it is very detailed. So I wanted to include this map in the park, in the atlas. So once again, I've broken this into north and south. And just to zoom in on the detail here, we see just how much of an ecological mosaic or patchwork the park really is, both in terms of forest types, ecosystem types, but also successional stages, right? We see that the park can be full of mature forests, but also places that are rebounding from more recent deforestation. I'll come back to this map in a little bit when I start reading some book excerpts in the second half of this talk. In chapter 3, I cover the human history of the park. This is broken down into Native American settlement before park creation, something I term the William Pryor Letchworth era, and then an era that I'm defining as after park creation, roughly 1907. Letchworth State Park is a really unique park in terms of just how much human history it really possesses, right? It's very atypical when you compare it to other state parks. There were entire communities within the present day park boundaries. Places like Gibsonville and St. Helena and Middle Falls. These were places with mills, in schools, in shops, in blacksmiths, in streets, in bridges. And so I think it was my duty within this project to bring that to life through maps and through data that's never really been portrayed via the map medium. It's also an exceptional park in that it has a very rich Native American history as well. Approximately 1/3 of Letchworth State Park was at one time's Native American reservation. The Gardeau Reservation and Squawky Hill Reservation comprised about 1/3 of the present day park area. And so that was another really important part of the human history to cover. William Pryor Letchworth, I'll get to him when I read some of my excerpts from my text, from my atlas. He was obviously integral to the creation of the park. It is his original 1,000 acres. That was the initial starting point for the entire 14,000 acre project that has become Letchworth State Park. And then I've also talked about here in chapter 3, after park creation, this era of park expansion, changes we see in active versus passive recreation styles, and so on. And then bringing forth into kind of the social media age where we see Twitter, Instagram make the park even more well-known and used and maybe even overused, right? So here are some maps that just are exemplify this third chapter here in terms of its human history. So here's map 54. This is schools, mills, and other buildings in 1852 for the north versus south end. It's a bit small, I imagine, for you in the back of the room to read these, but we see hotels, post offices, sawmills, schools, stores, train stations, all within the present day park boundary. I'm going to zoom in here on the south end, which is the most popular part of the park with the falls and the cliffs. We can see that this was actually an area of bustling activity in the 1850s. We had the Genesee Valley Canal. We had mills, a hotel, even a school, precariously placed just a few yards from the top of cliffs, just below Middle Falls, just downstream. We'll come back to this map later. This is one of my personal favorite maps in the park, in this park project, this atlas. It's a map of land acquisition by year. There was this incredible 6-foot-long map of Letchworth State Park land acquisitions that was available through the park archives that had never really been brought to life and presented. And to me, I just love this map because it just shows that land conservation, it's not just bestowed upon us from on high, right? It's a project that's undertaken by people that care. And it's not like Letchworth was all this 14,000 acre parcel of protected land. We see that in this map that what we now know is Letchworth State Park took time to evolve and to be pieced together. We can see the original 1,000 acre Glen Iris estate outlined in that subtle light red color. The darker shades of green represent older parcels. The lighter shades of orange represent newer parcels. Anything that's green is pre-1950. Anything that's orange is post-1950. And another map, so to speak. This is not quite a map, but it's an aerial photo. So what I wanted to do with this atlas is just bring to life some of the oldest aerial photos available for the park. This captures a really amazing moment in park history. If you know Letchworth State Park, you know that a lot of its infrastructure was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. I love this set of photos because it actually has those camps photographed just before they were just deconstructed, right? So here's an area, it's the Lower Falls area. If I zoom in a little bit more, we can see 2 of the camps at least, or actually, sorry, when I zoomed in, it's now just 1. It's number 2 there at the northeast corner. That's the Lower Falls camp. It actually became a prisoner of war camp. There were actually German POWs that were housed there for a period of time. So finally, in chapter 4, I covered purely the tourism-based aspects of the park. It's visitation, so who's visiting the park, where do visitors stay, and then also the activities. So what are some aspects of recreation, nature-based recreation in the park? So in that section, I have maps, for instance, on deer hunting, or fishing access points, or bird watching locations. Another really enjoyable part of this project was to figure out where Letchworth State Park visitors come from. Is it a very local or regional park, or does it have a more national or even international representation? So I have devoted 4 different maps to where visitors come from to Letchworth State Park. Every one of these data sets has its own bias and its own limitations, but they still tell sort of the general picture, same general idea about where Letchworth State Park visitors come from. Yes, it is highly regional, but we do also see visitors coming from across the US as well as even international. So I'll just zoom in here. This is a map of origins of a sample of visitors to the Letchworth Museum and Humphrey Nature Center. So what I did is I spent an afternoon going through all the visitor logs, figuring out where people were from, and then mapping those data. So we can see roughly 25 to 50% of all people that visit Letchworth State Park are from Western New York. We maybe see about 70% are from New York, and then 30%, roughly speaking, are from outside of New York State. Those of us who love Letchworth State Park always like to tout its status as being one of the best state parks in the country. And this map was devoted to that honor, that distinction. What I did is I mapped which parks were included in 3 different best state park contests or just best state park lists. So on this map, I mapped using 3 different symbols. The National Geographic 20 Wild and Beautiful US State Parks, the USA Today Reader's Choice Award for Best State Park, and then also Thrillist's 30 Best State Parks in America. If I zoom in, we see that there's only 2 parks that have made it onto all 3 lists. One of them is Hunting Island in South Carolina, which is the 6,000-acre coastal state park, and the other is Letchworth State Park. So the data do actually bear out the exceptional quality of Letchworth State Park as a recreational and scenic destination. It makes a lot of lists, and it makes the most lists of any park. You can see where we have those 3 symbols coinciding, we have a park making all 3 of those lists, right? Perhaps one of the most common pastimes or activities that occurs within Letchworth State Park is photography. Whether it's formal photography, professional photography, or whether it's just pulling out your smart device and taking selfies. In this photo, this map, I map out where most photos are taken. For this map, I developed a sample of 1,500 geotagged photos from the website Flickr. I mapped those onto the park, and then I created this heat map. And so the darker the purple color, the more photos that are taken there. If I zoom in here, there's no real surprise, right? So the major photograph, the major photogenic locations in the park are those spectacular waterfalls and cliff areas. So a very common theme, I would say, in this atlas that I've discovered is just how well known and how visited the north and south end of the park are, and how relatively unknown and unvisited the middle third of the park can be, right? So we see upper, middle, and lower falls are very photographed. Great Bend, the Wolf Creek area, St. Helena picnic area. And then we have this whole area that's hardly photographed. And then just some photos taken kind of in the dam area and in the camping area, Gibsonville, etc. For every roughly 3 maps that made it into this atlas, there was 1 that was cut. So a big part of this project was to create maps and to self-edit and to tell a compelling, cohesive story about Letchworth State Park. So I do like to spend some time talking about maps that didn't make it. There are a lot of reasons for cutting maps. 1, some of these maps were too similar to other maps, like tree canopy. I could map the density of trees, but that just became very similar to any map that shows kind of where forests are. It's a heavily forested area, so there were no big surprises if I were to have mapped tree canopy. I developed a data set that mapped the height of every single tree in Letchworth State Park. Too specialized, it just was already kind of covered by just talking about the natural history and the forest communities. The tallest tree in the park is about 155 feet, by the way, just by the Glen Iris. Some of them were just too weird. I developed this map of flight paths, which I love, but it just didn't tell, an important part of the story of Letchworth State Park. So here are all the flight paths over Letchworth State Park. My personal favorite here is this Paris to Houston flight. So it's actually a flight that is, I don't know how long of a flight that would be. What is that? Probably 10 hours, 12 hours. So if you're ever at the Hogsback overlook and you see a plane that's flying northeast to southwest or vice versa, it could be the Paris to Houston flight. I love the map, like I said, just didn't quite fit the narrative of the park's history. It was kind of hard to write about this map. There were some other surprising data sets that just didn't exist. I would have loved to make a map of entrance point statistics. So which park entry points are used the most or the least? The data just don't exist. The Park Service just doesn't maintain that data. I wanted to make a map of every place that had the Letchworth name in its place name, thinking that the park would have some sort of influence on the names of businesses, places, schools. Turns out there's only maybe 5 or 10 places that show up in place name databases with the word Letchworth in it. So it was kind of a boring map. I also didn't do anything too dark. I did spend a lot of time collecting data on tragedies in the park, 911 calls in the park. I think it's an important part of the story of Letchworth State Park that this is a dangerous location. But it was just a little too dark. It just brought down the book a little bit too much. I will, however, show you the location of 911 calls in the park. Once again, sticking with this theme, the north and south end, these are the most visited parts of the park, so we can see there that these two areas tend to see the most calls. For medical calls, 911 investigations. Directives are self-initiated calls like park police will say there's something going on, let's phone something in. The hotbed for that is Lower Falls. If you know Lower Falls, it's a very secluded area. There's that Table Rock, there's Cathedral Rock or Sugarloaf that people like to climb up. So it makes sense that the police are patrolling down there and calling in issues. Falls and traumatic injuries cluster towards the most popular areas, right? So some of the cliff areas, the fall areas where people are scrambling to take really risky selfies, let's say, or just doing other sorts of stunts where they shouldn't be. There's some other interesting maps that got cut. I wanted to pay homage to the employees of Letchworth State Park. I wanted to map employee hometowns, just to show that, it takes people from the surrounding community to keep this park running. Due to certain legal restrictions, they couldn't even share zip codes with me. I was hoping they'd share zip codes with me so that I could show where employees come from. I was denied. I didn't do many reference maps. Reference maps refer to maps that just simply portray the locations of key landmarks in the park, like roads, trails, water bodies. I didn't spend too much time on that. I didn't view this project as being about providing reference maps. It was more about thematic maps, right? Telling stories about the natural and human history of the park. And then there was also an entire chapter that got cut simply because there was no space. I wanted to devote a chapter to nearby communities, the communities that border the park. One reason it got cut was because there was no space, but the other reason was because communities around Letchworth State Park all are very similar. There weren't very many interesting spatial patterns in things like age, race, income, home ownership. All those maps kind of just look the same, and no one really lives inside the park like at the Adirondack Park, where you actually have residents inside. So that was a less important story to tell. Here's a map on town population and racial characteristics. If I were to zoom in really quickly here, we can see the larger the dot, the bigger the population, and then we can see different slices of the pie or different racial groups within each of these towns. So communities in upstate New York surrounding Letchworth State Park, they tend to be older, whiter, and more rural. There weren't many patterns in these maps that were interesting to convey, so that's why those got cut. Okay, what I would like to do with the remaining time is just to read some excerpts from my atlas. What I'm going to do is deconstruct and then reconstruct my atlas, and I'm going to pull out the most relevant excerpts related to the natural environmental history of this park, just given the nature of your talk. So what I'll do over the next several slides, I'll show maybe about 20 maps and just read the corresponding excerpts from the atlas. We begin our brief survey of the natural history and natural aspects of Letchworth State Park just after the last glacial period when a continent-sized ice sheet covered most of modern-day Western New York. As the massive ice sheet retreated with a warming climate around 12,000 years ago, the Genesee River carved a new path, producing the impressive gorge sections seen within portions of the park today as an eroded sedimentary rock, as seen here in map 16. The pre-glacial Genesee River purportedly flowed through modern-day Nunde and Keshiqua Creek valleys to the southeast of current-day Letchworth State Park. For a time, a glacial lake hull formed from meltwater that covered much of the present-day park near an elevation of 1,000 feet, roughly the elevation of the top of Middle Falls. The Genesee River in the middle portion of the park flows through a wider valley that was once part of an earlier and more mature course that existed prior to the most recent glaciation. The more narrow gorges toward the park's northern and southern ends are areas where the river had to work harder in order to erode the sedimentary rock. This is where we see those most impressive cliffs carved. The ice sheets left behind other evidence, glacial tills of ground-up rock material from their advance, as well as finer lake sediments formed at the bottom of ancient pro-glacial lakes created from glacial meltwater during the ice sheet recession. Left behind from the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet was a landscape bare of soil and vegetation. A long process of soil development and ecological succession began. Following glaciation, the region around Letchworth State Park was a tundra-like environment, and then as the climate warmed and more southerly tree species migrated northward, a mixed forest resembling today eventually developed. The forests of the area have always been in a state of flux during this time as different plant species migrated northward at varying rates due to differences in seed dispersal strategies, and as individual plant species have responded to climatic changes and other environmental forces. Human history of the park stretches back thousands of years and includes a long yet incomplete record of Native American settlement. Overall, the park is an archaeologically sensitive area, but is not a hotbed of known sites in comparison to the high-density areas just to the northeast. While no known Paleo-Indian archaeological sites exist in Letchworth State Park itself, evidence places hunter-gatherers and their ancient game species in Western New York as early as 11,000 years ago. For example, the Hiscox site 30 miles north of the park has yielded numerous artifacts dating to this time, including tools fashioned out of mastodon bones. Knowledge of who occupied the park area and when they occupied it is limited, but available data suggests that Native American people set up towns and camps nearby around 5,000 years ago and earlier. Offering a rough sketch of where Native American activity occurred over the last few millennia is map 50 shown here, showing the relative density of archaeological sites, from major town sites to unidentified stonework fragments in and around the park area. The map also shows the locations of notable archaeological sites within the park. Map 50 shows only approximate locations of sites to help ensure that they remain unvisited and undisturbed. The most notable archaeological site that has been investigated within the park boundary, predating the Iroquois, occurred at Squawky Hill at the park's northern end, what I'll point to with my laser pointer here. Archaeologists led by New York State archaeologist William Ritchie in the 1930s studied earthen burial mounds here dating to as early as 130 AD. Containing graves and numerous artifacts, the mounds themselves were discovered by a property owner around the year 1900. Archaeological evidence in sites around the park suggests that residents living in the region around this time, including those that built mounds at Squawky Hill, were a sparse population found at the periphery of regional population centers. They were part of the Point Peninsula cultural tradition, with groups around Lake Ontario to the north, yet adopted aspects of the wide-spanning Ohio Hopewell to the south. Available data also suggests that out of any area in the park, Squawky Hill was both occupied the longest and most consistently, yet still discontinuously, over a span of nearly 1,800 years, whether in the form of towns or camps. A few other towns and camps existed at various points throughout prehistory, both at the valley floor and in the upland areas within the park, and additional burial mounds are located within and near the park. But the cultural affiliation and date of occupation for most sites are uncertain. Other cultural groups inhabited western and central New York, aside from those associated with the Squawky Hill sites at the north end of the park, though few, if any, sites associated with these cultures have been definitively identified and described within Letchworth State Park. Map 51 shows Native American town populations in 1790, just before white settlement. The map also shows their approximate overland travel routes, one of which was located near where River Road on the park's east side is today. In 1790, nearly 750 persons lived in a 5-town area that included Squawky Hill within the park at its northern end. Near its southern end was the town of De Oesto or Nunde, with 48 persons counted. Note that these population totals are from 1790, just 11 years after American forces destroyed Seneca towns due to their support of the British during the Revolutionary War, around present-day Geneseo. Population numbers were likely much higher than those presented in this map prior to 1779. For instance, Geneseo or Little Beardstown alone had over 100 houses when destroyed. So the population could have totaled in the several thousand just before 1779. Prior to Euro-American settlement, the land that would become Letchworth State Park was predominantly forest, providing an invaluable yet brief record of the landscape around the year 1800. Land surveyors described forest conditions in and near present-day park, as they measured lands into towns and lots that were later sold to settlers. Towards the southern end of the park, land surveyors described forests as a mix of upland tree species composed of oak, pine, chestnut, and hemlock, with beech, maple, hickory, and ironwood in smaller amounts. Towards the northern end of the park, not shown here, forests contain mainly oak and hickory. Wetlands, as well as swales of moister land containing ash and basswood, as well as steep gullies containing pine and hemlock, occasionally disrupted this pattern in the uplands. In the bottomland forests along the Genesee River, forests growing atop rich alluvial soils contained elm, sycamore, butternut, poplar, sugar maple, basswood, ash, and black walnut. This map here portrays some of those descriptions that land surveyors made. We see descriptions of oak, beech, maple, hemlock, as well as bottomlands being described as elm, ash, buttonwood, butternut, and black walnut. Land surveyor data suggests that the park was located at a transition zone regionally between beech and maple dominated forests in the cooler, moister regions west, and oak dominated forests in the warmer, drier regions east. However, the landscape in and around present-day park also contained considerable areas that Native Americans utilized during the 18th century. Native Americans, mainly the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, including most importantly the Seneca, located towns along the Genesee River both within and outside the modern-day park boundary, connecting them by a network of well-established footpaths and canoe routes. Near towns were large clearings for agriculture, and in the uplands, Native Americans burned forests to remove brush to create an open environment that facilitated travel and hunting. Some of the descriptions that land surveyors provide to us provide evidence that Native Americans were using the landscape. Described occasionally were open flats along the Genesee River where Native Americans grew crops. If I were to flip back here and zoom in, we see one of those descriptions of an open flat occurring right within the park, right around the Gardeau overlook, where there was a small Seneca village for a time. Land surveyors also provided evidence that they were burning the woods. They described some areas as being thinly timbered. So here in the southeast portion of the park, a surveyor described the area as being thinly timbered with oak, some walnut, and chestnut, no underbrush. In my other research, that I have studied these descriptions and have determined that these descriptions signify thinly timbered environments, oak, savanna, grassy environments that are typically also associated with surface burning. One surveyor even specifically noted a hunting ground burnt over. between the park area and Silver Lake to the west. Just north in the current town of Geneseo was an expansive agricultural area along the Genesee River known as the Genesee Flats. Together with other data, these survey records suggest that in 1800, the present-day Letchworth State Park was a predominantly forested area, but also a mosaic of ecological communities and a mixture of both natural and human landscapes. The time from 1790 to 1830 was a transitional period between Native American and white settlement in the park area and surrounding region. Small Native American communities persisted on the Squawky Hill and Gardow reservations, whereas the Seneca sold off other reservations nearby, such as Little Beardstown in Geneseo. Some early white settlers lived among the Seneca. One surveyor noted a community of 6 white families and 5 Native American families farming along the Genesee River on the Gardow Reservation in 1807. Native American people moved elsewhere, including to other reservations west, and the Seneca sold off portions of the reservations in the park area in the 1820s. About 8 people were living at Squawky Hill in 1816. Also living on the Gardow Reservation since 1779 were Mary Jemison and her children, who acquired the reservation lands under the Treaty of Big Tree. The Seneca sold the last of the reservations as part of the first Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1826. The Seneca left Squawky Hill in 1828, and Jemison left Gardow in 1831. With those sales and departures, the land that the Seneca long possessed, including much of the land that would become Letchworth State Park, was now under white ownership completely. The history of Euro-American settlement or white settlement in the park begins in the 1790s. Overall, however, those settlers heavily used the land for timber and farmland throughout the next 2 centuries. White settlements within the current park boundary were not extensive, and population in towns comprising the present park area peaked around 1840 before declining until the start of the 20th century. By 1850, the foci of white settlement within the park area were the hamlet of Gibsonville, the hamlet of St. Helena, and milling operations around Middle Falls, as shown in this map. Just outside the park were also larger clusters of settlement in Mount Morris and Portage, and smaller clusters at Five Corners and River Road Forks. In the mid-19th century, within the modern park boundary were about 160 main buildings, including 12 mills and 5 schools, as estimated from historical maps. Around 1850, St. Helena had numerous mills and stores, a school, and a few dozen dwellings. Gibsonville to the north likewise had mills and stores, a school, and over half a dozen dwellings. North-south roads existed along the valley bottom. Although rough terrain and lack of bridges had limited travel between west and east sides historically, in the mid-19th century, there were numerous crossings over the Genesee River within the modern-day park boundary, some at bridges and others at low water fords. Compare that then to today, where we have only one crossing of the river in the entire park boundary. During the second half of the 19th century, the collective population of the surrounding towns steadily declined from around 13,000 in 1850 to 9,000 in 1900. Sawmills had exploited the forests of the area and were closing in the middle of the century, but agriculture persisted. By around 1900, there were about 140 buildings within the park area as estimated from historical maps. Still 5 schools as in the middle of the 19th century, but fewer signs of industry. Here we have map 46B, which shows roads and buildings in 1900. The number of river crossings by 1900 had shrank. Both the villages of Gibsonville and St. Helena within the park area had seen their peak in the middle of the century. Many pieces of evidence suggest their decline. Decreasing populations, fewer houses, post office closures, damaged mills not rebuilt, damaged bridges not replaced. Being located on the river bottom, on the valley bottom, compounding problems for St. Helena were regular floods on the Genesee River from rains and ice jams that inundated roads and buildings. Map 46 and C and map 46D show roads and buildings within the present day park area in 1950 and 2020 respectively. which show subtle changes, yet important changes in the road, in structure, geography, up until the present day. You see that loss of river crossing, the loss of structures, and we see the park area converted into the modern day park infrastructure that we know today. The park owes its existence almost solely to William Pryor Letchworth, whose estate formed the first 1,000 acres of the park in 1906. Mr. Letchworth was a businessman and philanthropist who made his fortune with Pratt and Letchworth in the city of Buffalo, manufacturing hardware for horses, saddles, carriages, and trains. In 1857, he sought to purchase the country estate when, at the suggestion of a friend, he took the train to the Portage Wooden Bridge to view the waterfalls on the Genesee River while returning to Buffalo from New York City. Here he found the ideal spot, a location replete with natural beauty, but also abused by industry. In 1875, he recalled his first glance at the land that would become his Glen Iris estate. There were unsightly objects in the form of ruinous buildings, he said. Quote, wrecks of abandoned enterprises and bare points that had been stripped of their foliage. In every direction, the eye encountered something that shocked the aesthetic sense. But I saw that nature was endeavoring to recover itself, end quote. What I personally find most interesting and just mind-blowing, before his fateful trip to Portage, he had considered situating his estate on the shores of Lake Ontario or the Niagara River. So it's totally possible that Letchworth State Park, as we know it, might not have existed, or what we know as Letchworth State Park might have existed on the Niagara River or Lake Ontario had he acquired land there and then later donated to the state. Map 59 shows the order of Mr. Letchworth's land purchases to create his estate, along with some modern day landmarks for reference. He purchased the first parcel of land around Middle Falls in 1858, but it took him almost 40 years for him to acquire the final parcel of land. At time, his land holdings were not contiguous, but he eventually pieced together one continuous property that included all major waterfalls and included lands up to Great Bend. As shown here in map 60, many of the improvements to the property that Letchworth commissioned can still be seen today. He added additions to his home residence, now known as the Glen Iris Inn. He commissioned stonework, park, water features, landscaping, and tree plantings. Notable landscape architect William Webster, who was a student of Frederick Law Olmsted, designed much of Mr. Letchworth's estate. Mr. Letchworth actually allowed visitors on his estate, and he even made improvements to facilitate viewing the gorge scenery, believing that allowing people to connect with nature could help cure some of the ills of society. I wonder if my great-great-great-uncle was one of those individuals who was allowed access onto the property way back when. As opposed to map 60 rather, map 25 estimates the minimum age of forest within the original Glen Iris estate today, by showing which patches of current forest were also forested in 1880 or 1950, as determined from historical maps and aerial photos. Basically, the darker the green here on this map, the older the forest. Those areas that are in dark green are areas that were forested in 1880. So those could hold some areas of old growth today. While mature forests of the park typically started growing around 1890, after an era of deforestation in the park area, tree ring samples from fallen trees have provided evidence of ancient trees in the oldest forests of map 25. One white oak near the Genesee Arch Bridge, where the railroad track crosses the river here in the north and southwest corner of this map. White oak is 375 years old, and an eastern red cedar tree near Inspiration Point was 435 years old. Many areas with old trees grow in inaccessible locations or are in areas acquired in the mid to late 19th century by Mr. Letchworth. Since Mr. Letchworth's 1,000-acre donation to the state of New York, the park has continually expanded. Land acquisition especially occurred in the 1920s to 1960s, but the state added a parcel to the park as recently as 2003. Map 61 shows the years in which the state purchased parcels. As already mentioned, shades of green represent parcels acquired before 1950. Shades of orange represent parcels acquired after 1950. The darker the green, the older the parcel, the darker the orange, the newer the parcel. Although exceptions exist, the state generally acquired the west side and portions of the east side, in other words, the majority of the park, from the 1920s to 1940s, and acquired much of the east side in the 1950s and 1960s. Interestingly, Mr. Letchworth remains the largest grantor of lands to the park, but 9 other individuals or families contributed around 200 acres or more to the park. The names of former owners are sometimes associated with roads and park landmarks, such as Kissel Point and Eddie's Overlook. Visitors today might not realize that the federal government owns 3,500 acres of the valley bottom and northern end of the park for dam operation and flood management, though it leases most of those lands to the state of New York. The forested character of the park emerged only after the 20th century park expansion and subsequent reforestation. Based on early topographic maps and aerial photos, map 24 shows areas that have reforested since 1940 versus those areas that were forested in 1940. In 1940, roughly half of the present-day park area was forested. Today, that number has increased to over 70%. Yet this number excludes the flooded bottomland of the Mount Morris Reservoir that contains patches of younger floodplain forest that are variably classified in data as either forest or shrubland. Older forests are likely those that reforested in the 19th century after clear cutting, former lots that their owners selectively logged, or untouched forests in inaccessible locations like remote river terraces and steep ravines. Even more so than in the past, modern Letchworth State Park is a patchwork of land cover types and forests of varying ages that has resulted from both the variability of environmental conditions and its history of human land use. 2 general land covers dominate Letchworth State Park at present. Forests cover the valley's slopes and uplands, whereas shrublands and areas routinely flooded by the Mount Morris Reservoir are found throughout the valley bottom of the northern 2/3 of the park. As shown in map 26, the most common types of forests are older oak hickory and hemlock northern hardwood forests, as well as younger northern hardwood forests. So a question becomes, just how important is Letchworth State Park as a habitat and refuge for plant and animal species? Compared to other state parks in New York, but excluding the Adirondack and Catskill Forest Preserves, Letchworth State Park is one of the most important for protecting species of concern within the state. As shown in map 28, the park ranks highly among state parks according to a 2004 report. It ranks first in documented rare plants, tied for second in documented imperiled animals, first in documented listed species combined, and tied for 11th in documented significant natural communities. None of those species of concern are federally listed endangered species, but the park could still contain undiscovered rare species. As shown in map 30, the park is one of the few large tracts of protected lands in all of Western New York State, where it is only smaller than Allegheny State Park and the Finger Lakes National Forest. However, life within the park faces threats such as invasive species that outcompete natives and the growing threat of climate change, both of which could alter the structure, composition, and function of the park ecosystem. Briefly, a natural environmental history of the park would be incomplete without discussion of its water resources. The most dominant water feature of Letchworth State Park is the Genesee River, which is shown here in this watershed map. Flipping over to map 39, we see the land cover within the Genesee River watershed. Of the nearly 2,500 square miles of land drained by the Genesee River, about 40% drains to the river before reaching Letchworth State Park, 4% drains to tributaries that flow through the park, and a minuscule amount drains through the park at its northern end to tributaries outside the park. Drainage upstream and south from the park is more forested, but drainage via tributaries through the park occurs mainly through farmland. Over 60% of the land drained before the park is forested, but just over 30% of the land drained through the park is forested. These land use issues have implications on water quality and amount, since forested watersheds generally have lower levels of pollutants and can better buffer against floods from high rainfall events, whereas agricultural watersheds have higher levels of pollutants from agricultural practices and have less capacity to buffer against floods. And last, I'll just leave you with this map here. This is an aerial view of the Mount Morris Dam. Humans have long altered the Genesee River's flow. For example, the state dredged the river to deepen it from St. Helena within the park downstream to York Landing in the 19th century. But perhaps the biggest alteration to its flow is the Mount Morris Dam, shown here in this aerial photo where my laser pointer is pointing. Constructed for flood control near the park's northern end, the dam regulates flow by impounding water in its reservoir and later releasing it at a rate downstream that does not cause flooding. Map 43 provides an aerial view of the dam and associated features, including a rope and timber boom that catches debris that might damage the dam, such as downed trees. Map 43 also shows the empty reservoir bed holding floodwaters. In the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly scan through some of these last maps, and I would be happy to answer any questions or to field any comments that you might have. So wrapping up here, I just had a map of the typical size of the Mount Morris Reservoir that's impounded by the Mount Morris Dam. I also had a few maps here on nature-based activities, recreation, and sports associated with the park. So bear harvest and deer harvest. And then I had a few maps also of bird observations in the park, which represents one of the popular kind of nature-based activities within the park. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Could you go back to that aerial shot of the dam?
Sure.
It's funny, every time we bring visitors, we get often the idea of taking them to the park, because it's one of our highlights in the area. People are up there at the viewing point of the dam, and they look and they say, well, where's all the water? You know, and they say, because, you know, they know further up, or we show them further up, there's these incredible waterfalls. Mm-hmm. And especially like the middle falls, you see this incredible amount of water. And then down here, you almost can't see any water at all. You say, okay, you do see a little bit of blue up there, but where does it all go between the lower falls and all these open areas here?
So it's what's known as a dry dam. It's purely for flood control. It's not for hydroelectric power. And so it only impounds water certain seasons, mainly early spring, some winters when it's kind of a mild spring with a lot of snow melt. That's actually what this map shows here. I can zoom in here. This map is showing typical reservoir size. It gives the 25th percentile, the median, and the 75th percentile. For 4 key months. So it has here January, April, July, and October. So April, this is 1 month where the reservoir is the biggest, because that's when we have our spring rains, we have a lot of snow melt. And that other map I showed you, it was the Genesee River watershed. So it's a fairly large watershed upstream from the dam. So we have a lot of areas contributing snow melt. And it was built originally to ultimately protect the city of Rochester, because the city of Rochester would flood roughly every decade, every couple decades. It was a very agricultural area upstream, and as mentioned, more agricultural watersheds, as you probably know here with Beaches Lake, more agricultural it is, the less buffering capability it has in terms of flooding, right? So forested areas are better able to hold water and slow down the flow of water. And what's really interesting too is it's kind of backwards, because the water is actually impounded after the dam. Further downstream from Mount Morris Dam, there is actually a small hydroelectric dam that RG&E operates that's only 10 or 15 feet high. And that one does permanently stop water for hydroelectric power. So this is the opposite of what you would expect, right? You'd expect the water to be behind the dam rather than in front of it. But due to some really unique, strange situations, this is what we see at Mount Morris Dam.
depth of the river in Letchworth?
That's a good question, I don't know. I know the depth of the reservoir. I mean, it can be in the worst, you know, the wettest springs, it can be 100 or 150 feet deep, it's quite deep. I think the depth of the Genesee River varies. There's certain places you could walk across it in summer, certainly. There's other places though where it's gonna be a deep pool. I mean, I would say, you know, the Riffley areas are probably 1 or 2 feet deep. Some of the deeper pools, maybe 6 or 8 feet deep. But as mentioned, the state did dredge it to facilitate river travel from the kind of the St. Helena area all the way down to York Landing. So that could be artificially deeper. It's probably silted up by this point, or filled in with sediment, but maybe it's also a little artificially deeper than it would be otherwise.
In the history that you studied, like what year or decade was it ever the lowest? I mean, the amount of flow going through, it's never been really low.
So the USGS does keep stream gauge data. That'll only go back maybe 50 years. So you can find stream depth data, maybe going back 50 years. Beyond that, it becomes a really tough question to answer. I'm sure if you wanted to really study the problem, you could figure it out. You could probably relate it to climate in a given year. But yeah, there were a lot of low water fords across the river where people were, you know, pulling horse-drawn carriages right across the river in certain key locations. You're not supposed to go in the water. I'm not advocating ever wading in the river, but if you were allowed access to the river within the park, there are several places you could probably wade right across in dry summers. Yep.
Could you go back to a map that shows the whole park? Just for a second, any map. I just wonder, you know, I know like at some times of the year they do river rafting and stuff like that as a tourist activity.
Yep.
Can you point out roughly where that takes place and how far north you can go or northeast you can go?
Sure. So
where there's enough water and that's
Where they launch from and where they.
yeah, so the whitewater rafting starts at Lee's Landing, which is downstream from Lower Falls, which is here, where my laser pointer is.
yeah.
And it wraps around Great Bend. It passes Wolf Creek and ends at St. Helena, which is right here. So it really only covers a mile or 2 of the river. Yep, I think that portion drops 75 vertical feet. So it's definitely it's the safest whitewater, right? You avoid the major falls, but it's still exciting. It's still whitewater, right?
Park overall is roughly 17 miles long, one end to the other.
You'll hear different numbers, and in my atlas, I have those numbers. I don't recall them off the top of my head. I think it's 15 miles as the crow flies. But the river distance is obviously longer. I think it's around 20 miles.
When was the CCC, when did it go in and build the roads and all the stone structures?
So kind of the mid-30s to the mid-40s. The camps were operating at slightly different times.
Can you go back to the picture your uncle took in the very beginning there that had the bridge or the train? Yeah. Is that's not there anymore, but is there artifacts of it? Are there evidence of it? Is there footings anywhere that I could find?
There still are. So there have been 3 bridges in the history of Letchworth. There was the original wooden bridge, which at its time was the largest wooden structure in the world. It only lasted 24 years. It got burned down. Then they built this one. This was the second bridge. This is the wrought iron bridge, which was the longest standing bridge in park history. It was from 1875 to 2010s, right? They did save some of it and kind of just as historical artifacts. If you visit that area, if you go hike up the stairs there or park at the bottom of at the top of the falls there, you can actually find the old footings.
How high is that?
What's that?
How high is that bridge?
220 feet.
They built that in what year?
1875, I believe.
You can do a map on how many people died making that bridge.
Well, it looks incredibly flimsy
Yeah,
when you think about, a train is gonna be vibrating and everything else, and it just doesn't look like it could be safe.
People were climbing up on it. I was one of those people. When I was younger, I would sneak past the barriers and go climb across the bridge where the walkway that you could look right down
I
between.
remember walking out into the middle and then straight down the fall.
Yep.
And, it's hoping a train would come.
The new bridges it can't be more than 10 years old, right? 15 years old. Yeah.
that was active within the last 10 years now.
Yes. And the reason it got replaced was because it was still seeing traffic and it was such a choke point. All the trains had to slow down and cross it because the trains couldn't go any faster on it. Yeah, so they engineered it so trains could go faster.
I'm curious what their favorite part is. I think the Hog's Neck is such an unusual, you wouldn't expect to find that in the Northeast. It looks like something like you would find out west. I've seen that when the water was up halfway of the trees on top.
Yes.
That's a lot of water, man.
So in my atlas, I devote a few maps to Hurricane Agnes. And Hurricane Agnes, it filled the reservoirs within about 4 feet of the top of the dam. And it completely submerged the Hog's Back. You can see the tops of the trees sticking up on the Hog's Back, and that's it.
That was in the 70s.
72, I was there, and just
Bunch. Portions of the Genesee River got 15 inches of rain in 5 days. And those areas, it all got funneled through Letchworth State Park, and that dam saved city of Rochester.
and
Again, the island or a peninsula?
That's a peninsula, yeah.
So that's the river on both sides.
Yep, it's an entrenched meander, geologists call it, right? So long ago, the river meandered and it kind of just got caught in its own U shape there and just eroded down into the bedrock.
If you look at a map that shows the Genesee River all the way up to Rochester, it is one of the snakiest rivers, probably next to the Mississippi. Do you have any idea, like, as a crow, if you could stretch the part through the park, how long the river actually is, or anybody ever?
So I do have those numbers, I didn't read them aloud though, so let me try to find them here.
Just even on the southwest corner of the park, it makes quite a bit of turn.
So within the park, I've estimated that the river is about 23 miles long through the park. Beyond it, it flows for about 69 miles.
the majority of the forest is deciduous versus coniferous.
Yes.
So therefore, there haven't been any forest fires.
I mean, for the entire northeast and New York State, we don't really see very many forest fires these days. I'm aware of only one situation where there was a forest fire in Letchworth State Park, and it was just a couple of years ago near Inspiration Point. It didn't really make the news. It was on social media a little bit. It was real small. It couldn't have been more than an acre. I think it was in similar time of year. Early spring, dry spring. Who knows? A cigarette butt ended up in the wrong spot.
Question, on
Yes.
this map here. I always thought Cancery Creek flowed south. And here it looks like the headwaters of it intersects almost with the Genesee River.
So according to this map, Canasarego flows northwest to join the Genesee River right around American Rock Salt, where that mine is.
I always thought it was south.
It does for a time, although, if you trace Canasarego Creek, it goes all the way up here and kind of loops back. So maybe you're referring to this part here, just southeast of Dundee. It does flow southeast and then it wraps around and flows northwest.
Where is the headwaters for the Genesee River? Is it in Pennsylvania?
It's in Potter County, it's in Ulysses Township. It's in Farmer's Pasture. There's a spring that was just considered the starting point of the Genesee River. And in this map, you can just see what little amount of the Genesee River is actually in Pennsylvania. So I did put the state border there.
We've heard that the Genesee River is one of the few rivers in the world that do flow south and north. When you compare other parts of the world, there are too many, right?
Right, I can think of the Nile, I can think of the Genesee River, maybe a couple other as well.
Siberia.
Blockbuster, yeah. Kenzie. Kenzie.
Yeah, maybe the Volga or the one in China, maybe? Forget.
You know, there's another interesting aspect of that. Genesee River is only, there's one place in Pennsylvania near where I grew up called the Triple Divide.
Yeah.
The Genesee River flows north, the Allegheny River flows, which becomes the Mississippi, flows west, and the Susquehanna flows south into the Chesapeake Bay.
I didn't label it here, but it's shown very subtly. So there's the Triple Divide point right there. This is Chesapeake Bay watershed over here. This is Mississippi watershed, and then everything else is Great Lakes. So it's, I didn't point to it or label it, but it's where my red pointer is. Yeah.
Well, it is, Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I got something. Together with our appreciation for giving us wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And maybe what we want to do, I just keep it as a souvenir. All right.
I will probably put this in my office. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
For anybody who might be interested, we did bring some books. My wife really got a couple of them.
Where can you purchase your book if you don't come here tonight? Other people that are interested.
So it's available.